Your gut doesn't need a supplement aisle. It needs something that's been sitting on Nordic tables for over 1,000 years, quietly doing more for digestion and mood than most bottles promising the same thing ever will. In Denmark, there's a loaf of bread so central to daily life that skipping it for more than a few days feels, to most Danes, genuinely strange. And the reason it matters has almost nothing to do with taste. There is a woman named Astrid who bakes rugbrød, dense Danish rye sourdough bread, every week using a starter passed down from her grandmother. A living culture of wild yeast and bacteria, now well over 60 years old. She feeds it, tends it, and would tell you, if asked, that she isn't really baking bread so much as maintaining a relationship, one that predates her, and one she assumes will outlast her too. Before we go further, I want to say something clearly, because it will change how you hear everything that follows. If your digestion has never quite felt settled, if mood and energy seem oddly tied to what you ate that morning in ways wellness culture keeps promising to explain but rarely delivers, that's not something wrong with you specifically. Modern diets, heavy in processed, sterile food, have quietly removed an entire category of living organisms your digestive system evolved alongside for millennia. And reintroducing them tends to matter more than almost any single supplement marketed to solve the same problem. This is a film about fermentation, why it became so deeply embedded in Nordic daily eating long before anyone understood the microbiology behind it, and 5 small, genuinely accessible shifts you can bring into your own kitchen without needing Astrid's 60-year-old starter or a lifetime of practice. Let's walk through what's actually happening and how you can borrow pieces of it. The first thing worth understanding is what fermentation actually does to food, specifically the live bacterial cultures it introduces and what they do once they reach your gut. Fermented foods contain populations of beneficial bacteria, often from the lactobacillus family, that research increasingly links to improved gut microbiome diversity, a factor now associated in numerous studies with better digestion, stronger immune function, and even mood regulation through what researchers call the gut-brain axis, the extensive communication network running between digestive bacteria and the brain itself. Astrid's rugbrød isn't simply bread that happens to taste sour. The sourdough fermentation process, wild yeast and bacteria breaking down the rye flour over many hours before baking, produces a genuinely different food than quick rise bread, one with living cultures present right up until the heat of baking, and compounds already partially broken down in ways that appear to make nutrients more bioavailable and the bread itself easier to digest than its non-fermented equivalent. The shift here doesn't require Danish rye or a grandmother's starter. It requires seeking out genuinely fermented foods, sourdough bread made through traditional slow fermentation rather than quick rise shortcuts, and beginning to treat them as a regular category of eating rather than an occasional specialty item. The second thing concerns filmjölk and skyr, the fermented dairy products found across Nordic breakfast tables, distinct from the heavily sweetened yogurt products that dominate American grocery shelves. These traditional preparations carry a more diverse range of live cultures, often multiple bacterial strains working together, compared to the single or double-strain cultures used in most mass-produced yogurt, and are typically consumed without the added sugar that can partially offset yogurt's benefits elsewhere. Astrid keeps a jar of filmjölk culture the same way she keeps her bread starter, continuously maintained rather than purchased fresh each time, each batch inoculating the next in an unbroken chain that, in her family, stretches back multiple generations. The shift is choosing plain, minimally processed fermented dairy when available, and treating added sugar as a signal that a product has drifted from what actually made traditional fermented dairy valuable in the first place. The third thing concerns variety. Specifically, the range of different fermented foods traditionally present across a single week of Nordic eating. rather than reliance on one single fermented product treated as a complete solution. Rugbrød, filmjölk, pickled vegetables preserved through lacto-fermentation rather than vinegar, each carries different bacterial strains, and research on microbiome diversity suggests variety in fermented food sources may matter as much as fermented food volume. Different strains supporting different aspects of digestive and immune function, rather than one strain doing everything. The shift is rotating rather than repeating, introducing 2 or 3 different fermented foods across a week, rather than relying on a single product, however beneficial, as your only source. The fourth thing concerns timing and consistency, specifically, fermented food as a genuinely daily presence, rather than an occasional wellness purchase reached for during a health kick and abandoned once the kick fades. Astrid's rugbrød isn't a special occasion food. It's simply what bread means in her household, present at nearly every meal. The same unremarkable regularity we've found true of nearly every effective practice in this series. Research on gut microbiome changes suggests the beneficial shifts associated with fermented food consumption tend to require sustained, regular intake rather than occasional exposure. The microbiome responding to consistent signals over time, much the way the cardiovascular system responds to consistent exercise rather than occasional intense effort. The shift is building at least one fermented food into a genuinely daily pattern, not a supplement taken sporadically, but a bread, a dairy product, or a pickled vegetable eaten with enough regularity that it simply becomes part of what a normal day of eating looks like. There's a specific trap worth naming here, one that mirrors a pattern we've seen throughout this series. Treating fermented food as a dramatic, temporary intervention, a 2-week gut reset, a sauerkraut phase abandoned once the novelty fades, rather than a quiet, permanent fixture. The microbiome doesn't respond meaningfully to 2 intense weeks followed by months of absence. It responds to the unglamorous, ongoing presence of these foods, the same way it responds poorly to their unglamorous, ongoing absence. The fifth and final thing concerns making rather than only buying. Specifically, the different relationship people tend to develop with fermented food once they've maintained a culture themselves, however simply, rather than only purchasing a finished product. Astrid describes feeding her starter as a small, almost meditative daily task, one that keeps her attention returning to something alive and slow-moving in a week otherwise dominated by things that move quickly and demand immediate response. There's a practical dimension, too. Homemade fermented foods, maintained continuously, tend to carry a more diverse and robust bacterial population than shelf-stable commercial products, which are often pasteurized after fermentation specifically to extend shelf life, a process that can kill much of the live culture the fermentation originally created. The shift is trying one simple fermentation project at home, even something as basic as a jar of lacto-fermented vegetables, salt, water, and thyme doing most of the actual work, and noticing whether the process itself, not just the eating, becomes its own small point of regular attention. There's something worth naming about this specific kind of task, distinct from most modern cooking, which tends to demand active, immediate attention. Fermentation asks for the opposite, a few minutes of preparation, followed by days of simply waiting while unseen organisms do the actual work. That waiting period, Astrid suggests, quietly teaches a kind of patience most modern food preparation has engineered entirely out of the process, a reminder that not everything worth having can be sped up simply because the technology to speed it up now exists. Here is the one idea tying all 5 of these together, the filter Astrid uses without ever formally naming it. Fermented food, to her, was never a health trend to adopt or abandon based on the latest research headline. It's simply inheritance, maintained the same unremarkable way you'd maintain any relationship worth keeping, through regular, quiet attention rather than occasional dramatic effort. This distinction matters more than it might initially seem, because it changes the entire emotional relationship to the practice. A health trend carries an expiration date built into its very framing, something you do until the next trend replaces it, evaluated constantly against whether it's still working, still popular, still backed by the latest study. Inheritance carries no such built-in exit. Astrid's starter doesn't need to prove itself against a new competing product each season. It simply continues, because continuing was never actually in question to begin with. And that stability, oddly, may be part of why it works as well as it does over a lifetime, rather than a fad's brief span. Before you go, here's a 2-minute test you can try today. Check your own kitchen for anything genuinely fermented. A jar of sauerkraut, plain yogurt with live cultures listed on the label, sourdough bread made through traditional fermentation. If you find nothing, that's simply information, a small, accessible category of eating currently absent from your regular pattern, worth introducing gradually rather than all at once. A more settled gut and a steadier mood were never built primarily through supplements. They were built the way Astrid builds hers, one regularly maintained living culture at a time, trusting that some of the oldest food traditions available were solving a problem modern science is only now fully able to explain. If this shifted how you think about your own kitchen, share it with someone who might need the reminder that sometimes the most effective wellness tools were sitting quietly on the table the whole time. What's one fermented food you already have in your kitchen? Tell us in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.